What if the most painful part of losing someone isn't how they died, but realizing they tried to reach you before it happened? Let that sit for a second. Because this story doesn't begin with flashing police lights or headlines scrolling across a screen. It begins with a silence. A silence inside a family that millions of people thought they understood. A silence that lasted years. And a silence that, according to one voice that finally broke through it, may have cost everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Today, we're talking about Rob Reiner, not the filmmaker, not the public figure, not the political commentator people argue about online. We're talking about a father, a husband, a man whose final chapter has been reduced to fragments, speculation, and assumptions. And now, for the first time, his youngest daughter, Romy Reiner, is speaking in a way that reframes everything we thought we knew. She didn't come forward to accuse. She didn't come forward to clarify legal facts. She came forward because, in her words, the pain became unbearable. And when she spoke, she said something that stopped people cold. He begged me for help. Not screamed. Not demanded. Begged. So here's the question you have to ask yourself right now. How many times have people asked for help in ways that didn't look urgent until it was too late? This story matters now because it's not just about a tragedy. It's about the uncomfortable space between love and distance, between knowing someone and truly seeing them, between thinking they'll be okay and realizing they weren't. And before we go any further, we need to slow down, because this is where most narratives rush in the wrong direction. What happened to Rob Reiner and his wife was horrific. Authorities have spoken. Charges have been filed. The legal process is ongoing. Those facts exist, and they matter. But that is not the heart of this story. The heart of this story is what happened before the headlines, before the investigations, before the world was watching. Because families don't break in a single moment. They fracture quietly, over time, through missed calls, short conversations, assumptions, emotional shortcuts we take because life is busy and pain is inconvenient. And Romy Reiner is not talking about a single night. She's talking about years. Years of loving someone who, by all outward appearances, was successful, powerful, surrounded by people. Years of believing that someone else was closer. Someone else was handling it. Someone else would step in if things were really that bad. Have you ever told yourself that? Someone else will notice. Someone else will help. If it was serious, I'd know. That belief feels comforting. Until it isn't. Romy's statement didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic press conference. No exclusive sit-down interview designed to dominate the news cycle. What came instead was raw, unpolished, emotionally fragmented. The kind of language people use when they're no longer trying to sound strong. She spoke of unimaginable pain, of devastation, of loss that doesn't follow logic or order. And in the middle of that grief, she shared something that shifted the entire frame of the story. Rob wasn't just someone who died tragically. He was someone who felt alone before he died. And that distinction changes everything. Because loneliness doesn't show up the way we expect it to. It doesn't always look like isolation. Sometimes it looks like independence. Sometimes it looks like confidence. Sometimes it looks like a person who has spent a lifetime being the one others lean on. And when someone like that asks for help, it often doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds casual. It sounds like a passing comment, a half joke, a sigh at the end of a sentence. Things have been hard. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I just need someone to talk to. How many times have you heard something like that and thought, they'll be fine? Romy has made it clear that she's not sharing her truth to assign blame. In fact, that's what makes her words so difficult to hear. There is no anger directed outward. No attempt to rewrite history in a way that paints her as a hero or anyone else as a villain. Instead, there is regret. And regret is far more unsettling. Because regret forces us to ask questions we don't want to answer. Questions like, if love existed, why wasn't it enough? If concern was there, why didn't it translate into action? If warning signs appeared, why did they feel so easy to dismiss at the time? Think about your own life for a moment. Is there someone you haven't checked on because they seemed okay? Is there a conversation you've been postponing because it feels awkward? Is there a message you meant to reply to but didn't? This is why Romy's words landed the way they did. Not because they revealed a secret, but because they reflected something painfully familiar. Another layer to this story, and one that's impossible to ignore, is the complexity of modern families. Proximity does not equal closeness. Living nearby does not mean emotional intimacy. Sharing DNA does not guarantee shared understanding. In this family, people were physically close, but emotionally, they were living in different worlds. And that's where assumptions grow. Romy has described a dynamic where she believed others were closer to her father than she was, that others had more visibility, more influence, more responsibility. It's a quiet psychological shift that happens all the time in families, especially when someone appears strong. You assume they don't need you as much. You assume your role is smaller. You assume your concern would be intrusive. And so you wait. But here's the part that stings the most. By the time you realize your presence mattered more than you thought, the moment has already passed. Romy has spoken through tears about that realization. About understanding, in hindsight, that what sounded like venting may have been a plea. That what felt manageable may have been overwhelming. That what seemed temporary may have been unbearable. And no amount of logic can undo that understanding once it sets in. This is not a story about failing someone. It's a story about how easy it is to misunderstand the depth of someone's pain, especially when they've spent a lifetime hiding it well. And that's why this matters now. Because we live in a culture obsessed with outcomes, with causes, with assigning responsibility. We want clean narratives, clear villains, definitive answers. But grief doesn't work that way. Sometimes the truth is messy. Sometimes it's incomplete. Sometimes it's just the quiet realization that love existed, but communication failed. Romy didn't confirm a scandal. She confirmed a heartbreak. She confirmed that her father asked for help in a way she didn't fully understand at the time. She confirmed that silence can live even inside families that appear close. And she confirmed something else that many people aren't ready to hear. You can love someone deeply and still miss what they're going through. And as we move forward in this story, we're going to peel back the layers slowly. Not to sensationalize, not to speculate recklessly, but to understand how a family arrived at a moment they will live with forever. Because what comes next isn't about the night everything ended. It's about the night everything still could have been different. And once you hear what happened in the final hours before the world changed, you may never hear the phrase, "he seemed fine," the same way again. What if the last normal moment happened so quietly that no one recognized it as the end of everything? That's the uncomfortable truth about most tragedies. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning sirens or dramatic pauses. They slip in through ordinary moments. Conversations that feel routine. Goodbyes that don't feel final. A night that looks, from the outside, like any other. This story picks up on that kind of night. The kind of night families later replay in their minds, over and over, searching for a signal they missed. A tone that felt off. A pause that lasted a little too long. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Because before the headlines, before the shock, before the world began dissecting every detail, there was a moment when everything still seemed intact. And that's what makes it unbearable. Picture the atmosphere. Laughter in public spaces. Familiar faces. Longtime friends exchanging stories they've told 100 times before. The kind of gathering where nothing feels dangerous because it's wrapped in routine. Comfort. History. From the outside, it looked like stability. But families don't unravel in public. They unravel in the quiet spaces afterward. In the car rides home. In the silence between texts. In the rooms where everyone finally drops the performance. Have you ever noticed how the most important moments in life often happen when no one is watching? That night, no one knew they were standing at the edge of a before and after line. No one knew that casual conversations would soon be replayed with forensic intensity. No one knew that the word last was quietly attaching itself to ordinary actions. Last shared laugh. Last shared meal. Last moment of believing there would be time later. And this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable, because hindsight is cruel. We know what came after. We know the ending. But the people inside the moment didn't. They were operating under the assumption we all live with most days. Tomorrow is guaranteed. Romy wasn't there that night. And that detail matters more than people realize. Because distance changes perspective. It changes responsibility. It changes how you interpret silence. When you're not physically present, you rely on assumptions, on secondhand impressions, on the belief that if something were truly wrong, someone closer would step in. Someone always closer. That's the quiet mental calculation we make without realizing it. The mental passing of the baton. And that's why this chapter isn't about what happened after everyone went home. It's about what happened before. According to those familiar with the family dynamic, the atmosphere leading up to that night wasn't explosive. There was no single dramatic argument that everyone points to and says, "That's when it all fell apart." Instead, there was something far more insidious. Tension without confrontation. Concern without clarity. Love without understanding. That kind of emotional fog is dangerous because it convinces everyone that things are manageable, that nothing urgent needs to be addressed tonight, that there will be another conversation later. But what if later never comes? Let's talk about the illusion of closeness. From the outside, the family appeared connected. Proximity, shared history, decades of intertwined lives. But emotional closeness doesn't always match physical or social proximity. Sometimes it runs parallel without ever intersecting. People assume that if someone lives nearby, they're being checked on. They assume that if someone seems functional, they're coping. They assume that if someone hasn't explicitly said, "I'm not okay," then they must be okay. But what if the person asking for help doesn't know how to make it sound urgent? Romy has hinted that her father didn't speak in alarms. He didn't dramatize his pain. He communicated the way many people do when they're trying not to burden others, indirectly, softened, downplayed. And that's the contradiction that haunts this story. The man the world saw as powerful may have felt powerless in private. The man others leaned on may not have known how to lean back. The man surrounded by people may have felt emotionally alone. Ask yourself this. How often do we mistake self-control for strength? That night, those around him saw familiarity, routine. A man who had navigated far more complicated situations in life. A man who had weathered storms before. So why would this be different? That question, why would this be different, is the most dangerous one of all. Because it convinces us not to ask follow-up questions, not to push, not to insist. It convinces us to let moments pass. Romy has described a growing realization that her absence from that night created a vacuum. Not because she believes she could have changed the outcome through force or confrontation, but because presence matters in ways we don't fully understand until it's gone. Sometimes presence isn't about fixing anything. Sometimes it's about being a witness. Sometimes it's about making someone feel seen. And here's where the emotional contradiction sharpens. Romy loved her father, by all accounts, deeply. But love alone doesn't automatically translate into insight, especially when distance, schedules, and emotional assumptions get in the way. She wasn't ignoring him. She wasn't dismissing him. She was living under the same illusion most of us live under, that there would be another opportunity to show up more fully. That illusion shattered later. But on that night, it still felt intact. There's another layer here that people rarely talk about. The way families assign emotional roles without ever agreeing on them. One person becomes the strong one. Another becomes the sensitive one. Another becomes the one who handles crises. Once those roles are assigned, everyone unconsciously behaves accordingly. You hesitate to intrude on the strong one. You assume the crisis handler has it covered. You downplay your own instincts because they don't fit the role you think you're supposed to play. Romy has hinted that she didn't see herself as the primary emotional anchor in her father's life. She believed others were closer, more involved, more aware, and that belief shaped her response, or lack of one. Think about how many families operate this way without ever acknowledging it. We delegate emotional responsibility the same way we delegate chores. Quietly, implicitly, without discussion. And then, when something goes wrong, everyone realizes too late that no one was actually in charge. That night, no one stood up and said, "We need to stop pretending everything is fine." Because pretending felt easier. It always does. The night ended the way countless nights end, with goodbyes that didn't feel heavy enough to linger, with plans that assumed continuation, with the comfort of routine. And somewhere in that sequence of ordinary events, the window for intervention quietly closed. This is the part people struggle with the most. They want a clear turning point, a moment where someone could point and say, "That's when the mistake happened." But grief doesn't give us that clarity. Instead, it gives us fragments. A sentence remembered too late. A tone that feels different in hindsight. A moment that didn't stand out at the time, but now won't stop replaying. Romy has described the agony of reconstructing that night in her mind. knowing that she wasn't there to sense the emotional undercurrents firsthand, knowing that she relied on the assumption that if something were truly wrong, she would be told directly. But people don't always tell us directly. Sometimes they hope we'll just know. And that's where this story tightens its grip. Because the night everything changed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself as a crisis. It slipped by unnoticed. And the next morning, the world woke up to a reality no one was prepared for. But before that morning arrived, before shock turned into headlines, before grief turned into public scrutiny, there was one final stretch of hours that would later become the most painful territory of all. Because those hours hold the question Romy now lives with. What if she had been there? What if she had asked one more question? What if she had recognized the plea beneath the words? That question doesn't accuse anyone else. It accuses time. And as we move into the next chapter, we're going to step inside the space where proximity and distance collided, a place where people lived near each other, but not necessarily with each other. Because what happened after that night wasn't just a tragedy. It was the collision of assumptions that no one realized they were making. And once you understand how close everyone was, and how far apart they truly felt, you'll understand why Romy says the most painful part wasn't the loss. It was realizing how invisible his loneliness had been. How can people live so close to one another and still miss what matters most? That question sits at the center of this chapter. Because when the public first learned that members of the same family were living on the same property, many people jumped to the same conclusion. They must have been close. They must have seen each other all the time. They must have known what was going on. But proximity is one of the most misleading indicators of connection there is. Living near someone is not the same as living with them. Sharing land is not the same as sharing emotional space. And being available does not mean being reached. This chapter isn't about architecture or real estate. It's about the illusion of access. The dangerous comfort that comes from believing closeness exists simply because distance doesn't. On paper, everything looked connected. One property, multiple living spaces, family members moving in and out of each other's orbit. To the outside world, it suggested unity, support, oversight. But families don't operate on floor plans. They operate on habits, on boundaries that harden over time, on assumptions that quietly replace communication. And this is where the story deepens. Because what Romy would later come to understand is that the physical setup may have created a false sense of security, not just for the public, but for the family itself. Think about how often we do this. We tell ourselves someone is right there, so we don't check in. We assume someone else sees them daily, so we don't ask how they're really doing. We believe access equals awareness. But what if it doesn't? In this case, separate living spaces meant separate rhythms, separate routines, separate emotional realities unfolding side by side without intersecting. One life moving forward as usual, another quietly unraveling, and no one fully aware of how far apart those paths had drifted. Romy has spoken, not directly about logistics, but about perception, about believing that others were closer to her father's day-to-day life than she was, that they had eyes on him, that they had a clearer sense of his emotional state. That belief didn't come from indifference. It came from trust. Trust that if something were truly wrong, the closeness of others would act as a safety net. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That belief is incredibly common. We assign emotional responsibility based on geography without ever saying it out loud. Who lives closest? Who sees them most often? Who would notice first? Those unspoken assumptions become the foundation for inaction. Romy didn't see herself as the primary checkpoint. She didn't believe she was the person who needed to be on constant alert. She believed, reasonably, that proximity created awareness. But awareness isn't automatic. It has to be intentional. And intention fades when life feels busy but stable. The separate living arrangements created something subtle and dangerous: parallel lives. Lives that occasionally overlapped, but mostly ran independently. Meals weren't always shared. Conversations weren't always deep. Silence could stretch without raising alarms. And silence, when normalized, stops sounding. And when she finally described what it felt like to speak out, not as a daughter seeking answers, but as someone drowning in regret, it changed how people heard the story entirely. Because the truth she confirmed wasn't about what happened in a house. It was about what didn't happen between people. And once you hear how close she came to breaking her silence sooner, and why she didn't, you'll understand why this story isn't just tragic. It's haunting. What does it take for someone to finally stop protecting everyone else and tell the truth that hurts them the most? That's the question that opens this chapter. Because silence doesn't break easily, especially not in families shaped by public scrutiny, expectations, and the unspoken rule that private pain should stay private. Romy didn't wake up one morning planning to speak. She didn't map out her words. She didn't rehearse strength. What happened instead was far more human. The silence collapsed under its own weight. And when it did, it wasn't dramatic. It was fragile. It was uneven. It was emotional in the way grief is when it's no longer being managed, when it spills out faster than you can organize it. Her voice didn't sound like someone making a statement. It sounded like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. The first thing people noticed wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. There was no performance, no polish, no attempt to guide the narrative in her favor. The words came out heavy, almost reluctant, as if speaking them made everything more real. And that's when the public realized something important. This wasn't about explanation. It was about survival. Romy described pain in a way that didn't seek sympathy, only understanding. She spoke of devastation that didn't follow a straight line, of emotions colliding rather than resolving, of grief that refused to be neat. She wasn't trying to correct rumors. She was trying to breathe. And in the middle of that emotional unraveling, she said something that changed the way people listened. She didn't say, "We didn't know." She said, in effect, "I didn't understand." That difference matters. Because not knowing implies ignorance. Not understanding implies proximity without clarity. It implies that the information was there, but its meaning wasn't. And that's a far more painful realization. Romy has spoken about how, in the days after the loss, the world became unbearably loud. Everyone had questions. Everyone had opinions. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But inside her own mind, everything was strangely quiet. That's often how shock works. Noise on the outside, stillness on the inside. In that stillness, memories start to rearrange themselves. Conversations replay. Messages resurface. Moments you didn't mark as important suddenly demand attention. And this is where grief becomes cruel. Because it hands you clarity only after it's useless. Romy described feeling like she was watching her own past from a distance, seeing things she couldn't see before, hearing the emotional undertones in words she had once taken at face value. A comment that once sounded casual now sounded heavy. A complaint that once sounded manageable now sounded desperate. A pause that once felt insignificant now felt loaded. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever looked back at a moment and thought, "How did I miss that?" That question doesn't accuse your intelligence. It accuses timing. Because understanding often arrives too late. Romy's breakdown wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual surrender. A slow erosion of the emotional armor she had built to function in the aftermath. She tried to stay composed. She tried to stay quiet. She tried to let the process unfold without adding her voice to the chaos. But grief doesn't respect intentions. It doesn't care about what you're ready for. And the pressure of carrying unspoken regret began to show. She has spoken about nights where sleep felt impossible. About moments when the weight of what she wished she had said pressed harder than the loss itself. That's an uncomfortable truth many people avoid admitting. Sometimes regret hurts more than grief. Because grief mourns what you lost. Regret punishes you for what you didn't do. And Romy was drowning in questions she couldn't answer. What if I had called more often? What if I had asked better questions? What if I had pushed instead of assuming? Those questions don't have resolutions. They only echo. When Romy finally spoke publicly, it wasn't because she had answers. It was because the questions were consuming her. And this is where the story takes a turn that many people didn't expect. Instead of focusing on events, she focused on emotions. Instead of recounting timelines, she talked about feeling. Instead of offering certainty, she offered vulnerability. She described pain that felt unimaginable, loss that felt unreal. And then, quietly, she revealed the part that shattered her most. That her father had reached out. Not dramatically, not urgently, but sincerely. He asked for help in a way that didn't look like a crisis. And that's the part that keeps people up at night. Because if someone had screamed, everyone would have responded. If someone had demanded, no one would have ignored it. But he didn't. He asked in a way that required interpretation. and interpretation depends on context. Romy has reflected on how she interpreted those moments through the lens of who she believed her father to be: strong, capable, resilient, someone who had handled worse. So when he spoke of difficulty, she heard stress, not desperation. She heard frustration, not fear. And that interpretation felt reasonable at the time. That's what makes regret so dangerous. It rewrites the past with knowledge you didn't have. And once that rewriting begins, it doesn't stop. Romy has spoken about how her grief turned inward, how she began questioning not just her actions, but her instincts, her emotional literacy, her ability to recognize pain in the people she loved most. That kind of self-doubt is destabilizing, because it doesn't stay contained to one relationship. It spreads. It makes you question every interaction you've ever had, every assumption you've ever made, every time you told yourself, they'll be okay. And here's where the contradiction sharpens again. Romy didn't ignore her father. She didn't dismiss him. She loved him. But love didn't come with a manual. It didn't teach her how to decode what wasn't being said. It didn't warn her that restraint can be a disguise. It didn't tell her that asking softly can be a sign of deep pain. Those lessons came later. Too late. Her public words weren't an attempt to absolve herself. If anything, they did the opposite. They exposed a vulnerability most people would hide. She admitted uncertainty. She admitted misunderstanding. She admitted regret. And that honesty made people uncomfortable, because it forced them to look inward. How many times have you minimized someone's pain because it didn't look dramatic enough? How many times have you assumed someone was okay because they didn't ask twice? How many times have you relied on someone else to notice what you didn't? Romy's breakdown resonated because it wasn't unique. It was painfully relatable. She wasn't telling a story of neglect. She was telling a story of misinterpretation. And that's far harder to confront. Because misinterpretation doesn't come from malice. It comes from familiarity, from routine, from the belief that you know someone well enough to recognize when things are truly wrong. Sometimes that belief is wrong. Romy has spoken about the moment she realized she could no longer stay silent. Not because the public demanded it, but because silence had become unbearable. Keeping everything inside didn't protect anyone. It didn't preserve dignity. It didn't make the pain smaller. It made it heavier. And so she spoke. Not to explain what happened, but to explain what it felt like to realize she had misunderstood a plea for help. That realization doesn't fade. It doesn't resolve. It becomes part of who you are. And this is where the story prepares to shift again. Because once Romy broke her silence, people began re-examining everything they thought they knew. Not just about the events, but about the emotional landscape that led up to them. Her words reframed the narrative. This wasn't a story of sudden tragedy. It was a story of gradual isolation. And in the next chapter, we're going to confront the most haunting part of her statement. The phrase that continues to echo long after the headlines fade. The words that didn't sound alarming at the time, but now sound like a warning no one recognized. Because when you finally understand what she meant by, "He begged me for help," the story stops being about loss and becomes about listening. What does begging really sound like when it comes from someone who spent their whole life never asking? That's the question that hangs over this chapter. Because when Romy said those words, "He begged me for help," the reaction was immediate and divided. Some people imagined desperation. Others imagined a dramatic plea, and many assumed it must have been obvious. But that assumption is exactly where this story becomes dangerous. Because begging doesn't always look like begging. Sometimes it looks like a tired joke. Sometimes it sounds like frustration disguised as humor. Sometimes it comes wrapped in calm language that feels almost polite. And when it comes from someone you believe is strong, capable, and in control, it's easy to hear it as something else entirely. Romy didn't describe a moment of panic. She didn't describe fear spilling over. She described something quieter. And that's what makes it haunting. When she reflected on those words, she wasn't trying to dramatize the past. She was trying to translate it. To explain how something that didn't feel urgent at the time now feels unmistakable in hindsight. That's the cruel trick grief plays. It sharpens the edges of memory. Things you once skimmed over now feel underlined. Words you once heard casually now feel weighted. Moments you once forgot now replay on a loop. Romy has said that her father didn't beg the way movies teach us to expect. There was no collapse, no raised voice, no desperate demand. Instead, there was repetition. And repetition is often the real signal. He returned to the same concerns, the same frustrations, the same emotional themes. He circled them, carefully, as if hoping someone would connect the dots without him having to say the most frightening part out loud. Have you ever done that? Have you ever hinted instead of stated? Hoped instead of demanded? Waited for someone to notice what you didn't know how to say plainly? Most people have. And that's why this part of the story resonates so deeply. Romy has described realizing, too late, that her father was testing the water, that each time he spoke about feeling overwhelmed, or tired, or unsure, he may have been gauging her response. Would she ask more questions? Would she slow down? Would she hear what he wasn't saying? But life doesn't pause for subtext. And Romy, like most of us, responded based on the information she thought she had, not the information she would later wish she'd recognized. She reassured. She normalized. She believed things were hard, but manageable. And that belief didn't come from indifference. It came from love mixed with familiarity. Because when someone has always been resilient, we trust their resilience more than their vulnerability. We assume they'll bounce back. We assume this is temporary. We assume they've been through worse. Romy has spoken about how her father never framed his struggles as something she needed to fix. He didn't say, "I can't handle this." He didn't say, "I'm scared." He spoke in fragments. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Things feel heavier than they used to. I'm exhausted in a way sleep doesn't fix." Those sentences can sound like stress. They can sound like aging. They can sound like frustration with circumstances. But taken together, over time, they form something else. They form a pattern. And patterns are easy to miss when they develop slowly. Romy has said that part of her regret comes from how normal those conversations felt at the time. They didn't stand out because they didn't break the rhythm of daily life. That's the danger of subtlety. It blends in. And once it blends in, it stops triggering alarm. Ask yourself honestly, if someone you loved said those things to you, would you hear desperation? Or would you hear fatigue? Most people would hear fatigue. That's why Romy's words matter so much. Not because they accuse anyone, but because they expose how fragile interpretation can be. She has reflected on how she now believes those conversations were moments when her father was reaching as the only way he knew how. Carefully, indirectly, without wanting to frighten anyone. Because some people don't want help if it means becoming a burden. They want understanding without disruption. Support without pity. Presence without panic. And that kind of help is the hardest to give, because it requires intuition rather than instruction. Romy didn't lack care. She lacked context. And context often arrives too late. She has described the moment when that realization crystallized. It wasn't immediate. It didn't happen in the chaos. It came later, in quiet moments, when the noise died down and memory took over. She began connecting conversations across time. Hearing how often the same themes returned. How consistently her father circled the same emotional territory. That's when the phrase "he begged me for help" took on its full meaning. Not as a single event, but as a pattern she didn't recognize while it was happening. And that realization changed the way she saw herself. Not as someone who failed deliberately, but as someone who misunderstood unintentionally. That distinction doesn't make the pain easier. In some ways, it makes it harder. Because mistakes made without malice offer no clear lesson except this: good intentions are not enough. Romy has spoken about how this understanding forced her to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That emotional intelligence is not automatic, even in loving families. We assume love teaches us how to listen. We assume closeness teaches us how to interpret. We assume time teaches us how to recognize pain. But none of that is guaranteed. Listening is a skill. Interpretation is a skill. Recognizing emotional distress is a skill. And skills can be underdeveloped, even in people who care deeply. Romy's honesty stripped away the comforting myth that love always knows what to do. Sometimes love guesses. Sometimes love assumes. Sometimes love gets it wrong. That doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it human. She has said that the most painful part wasn't realizing her father was struggling. It was realizing that he trusted her enough to say something. And that she didn't fully understand what he was asking for. That realization cuts deep. Because it reframes every memory. It turns reassurance into dismissal, even if it wasn't meant that way. It turns calm responses into missed opportunities. It turns silence into something heavier than words. And this is where many people misunderstand Romy's statement. She isn't saying she was asked to prevent something specific. She isn't saying she was given a clear warning. She's saying she now believes the request was emotional, not logistical. He wasn't asking her to fix anything. He was asking her to stay longer, to listen harder, to take his discomfort seriously. And those requests are easy to overlook when life feels busy but stable. Romy has admitted that part of her assumed her father would always reach out again if things worsened, that he would escalate his language, that he would make it clearer. But not everyone knows how to escalate. Some people retreat when they feel unheard. Some people decide not to ask twice. Some people conclude that if the first attempt didn't land, the second won't either. That possibility is what haunts her now, not knowing whether his final silence was acceptance or resignation. And this is where the audience needs to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people stop asking for help not because they don't need it, but because they believe they've already asked. Think about that. How many times have you assumed someone would tell you if things were really bad? How many times have you relied on escalation as your signal? How many times have you told yourself, if it was serious, they'd say something? What if they already did? Romy's story forces that question into the open. Her words have resonated not because they reveal a hidden detail, but because they reveal a hidden dynamic, one that exists in countless families. The dynamic where concern is expressed gently and missed, where reassurance is offered too quickly, where urgency is assumed to be loud. And once you understand that, the phrase "he begged me for help" stops sounding dramatic. It starts sounding tragically ordinary, because begging doesn't always come on its knees. Sometimes it comes in conversations we wish we could revisit. And as Romy has learned, you don't get to revisit them. You only get to reinterpret them. That reinterpretation doesn't bring peace. It brings responsibility, the kind you carry forward, hoping it changes how you listen next time. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to look at how this realization collided with something even more complicated, the fact that everyone in the family saw the same man differently. Different roles, different relationships, different versions of truth. And once you see how those versions diverged, you'll understand why Romy says the hardest part isn't what she lost. It's what she didn't understand until it was irreversible. How can the same man be remembered in completely different ways by the people who loved him most? That question doesn't have a clean answer. And that's exactly why this chapter matters. Because families don't share a single reality. They share overlapping ones. Each person interacts with a different version of the same individual, shaped by timing, proximity, personality, and unspoken expectations. And when tragedy strikes, those differences don't disappear. They collide. Romy didn't grow up with a singular image of her father. She grew up with moments, conversations, emotional snapshots that didn't always align with what others experienced. And after the loss, she began to realize something unsettling. Everyone thought they knew him best. Not out of ego, not out of competition, but because each relationship felt complete from the inside. That's how families work. One child sees warmth. Another sees authority. Another sees distance. Another sees vulnerability. None of them are wrong, but none of them are the whole picture either. This is where grief becomes complicated. Because when people grieve, they don't just mourn the person, they mourn their version of the person. And when those versions don't match, it can feel like reality itself is unstable. Romy has spoken about how this realization hit her slowly. In conversations after the fact. In quiet moments when stories were shared and didn't line up the way she expected them to. Someone would say, he was doing better. Someone else would say, he seemed tired. Someone else would say, he didn't say anything was wrong. And each statement was true. That's what made it unbearable. Because it meant there wasn't one obvious warning sign everyone. They each held a version of him that felt complete because it was complete within that relationship. This chapter forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That love does not guarantee awareness. You can love someone deeply and still misunderstand what they're going through, not because you don't care, but because you're seeing them through a specific emotional lens. Romy has spoken about how she began questioning her own memories. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. She remembered moments of laughter, of reassurance, of normalcy, and she wondered how those moments coexisted with the pain others later described. The answer wasn't deception. It was compartmentalization. People often present different emotional selves to different people, especially within families. You don't show your children the same fears you show your peers. You don't show your youngest the same weight you show your equals. You don't show everyone the same cracks. And that means no one sees the whole structure. Romy has admitted that part of her grief came from realizing she may have been seeing the most protected version of her father, the one designed to keep her from worrying. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought guilt. Because protection, in hindsight, felt like exclusion. Not intentional exclusion, but emotional distance created out of love. And that's a brutal paradox. He may have been protecting her from his pain. She may have been protecting him from being confronted. Both acting out of care. Both unintentionally contributing to silence. When Romy listened to others describe their experiences, she began to notice how fragmented the family's understanding truly was. No one had a full timeline. No one had a complete emotional map. No one knew which version was closest to the truth. And grief turned those differences into pressure. Pressure to reconcile memories. Pressure to align narratives. Pressure to explain why things unfolded the way they did. But families don't owe the world a single story. They owe themselves honesty. And that honesty is messy. Romy has said that one of the most painful realizations was understanding that her father may have felt misunderstood by everyone in different ways. Not unseen, misunderstood. Seen, but through incomplete frames. That kind of misunderstanding can feel lonelier than invisibility, because it means people are looking at you, but not seeing what hurts. Have you ever experienced that? Being surrounded by people who care, yet feeling like no one truly understands what you're carrying? That's the loneliness Romy now believes her father may have been navigating. Not isolation, not abandonment, but fragmentation. Each relationship offering support, but none offering the specific understanding he needed. And because no one person had the full picture, no one knew how serious it was. This is where the story pushes back against a dangerous myth. The myth that someone surrounded by family cannot feel alone. Loneliness isn't about numbers. It's about resonance. It's about whether anyone hears the frequency you're speaking in. Romy's reflections have made it clear that she doesn't blame anyone else for what happened. If anything, she has become acutely aware of how shared responsibility can feel like no responsibility at all. Everyone believed someone else was closer. Everyone believed someone else would notice first. Everyone believed someone else had the deeper insight. And those beliefs canceled each other out. That's not negligence. That's diffusion. And diffusion is one of the most dangerous emotional dynamics there is, because it allows silence to persist under the illusion of care. Romy has said that understanding this has changed how she approaches every relationship now, that she no longer assumes understanding exists just because love does. She asks more questions. She listens longer. She resists the urge to reassure too quickly, because reassurance can sometimes shut down conversation instead of opening it. When someone says, "I'm struggling," and we reply, "You'll be okay," we may be offering comfort, but we may also be closing a door. Romy wishes she had known that then. She wishes she had understood that asking follow-up questions isn't intrusive, it's attentive. But regret doesn't come with instructions for undoing the past. It only offers lessons for the future. And this is where the emotional weight of this chapter settles. Not on blame, not on guilt, but on awareness. Awareness that families are made of perspectives, not absolutes. Awareness that silence can exist even where love is abundant. Awareness that understanding must be actively built, not assumed. As we move into the next chapter, the focus shifts again, from internal family dynamics to the outside world pressing in. Because once Romy spoke, the public narrative intensified. Grief stopped being private. Pain became a topic of debate. And when the weight of public grief collided with personal regret, it created a new kind of pressure, one that forced Romy to confront something she wasn't prepared for. The realization that mourning in the spotlight changes everything. And once you hear how that pressure affected her, and how close she came to retreating back into silence, you'll understand why speaking out became both her greatest fear and her only relief. What happens when your private pain becomes public property before you've even learned how to breathe again? That's the question Romy found herself facing next. Because grief, when it's forced into the spotlight, changes shape. It stops being something you process internally and becomes something you're expected to perform, explain, or defend. And that pressure can be crushing. For Romy, the days after she spoke were not clarifying. They were disorienting. The world didn't slow down to give her space. It accelerated. Headlines multiplied. Commentary expanded. Opinions hardened. Suddenly, her grief wasn't just hers. It was being interpreted. People read her words and decided what they meant. Some heard courage. Some heard accusation. Some heard a coded message they believed they could decipher better than she could explain. And that's when public grief becomes dangerous. Because it strips nuance from pain. Romy didn't speak to invite speculation. She spoke because silence had become unbearable. But once her words were out there, they took on a life of their own. Every sentence was dissected. Every phrase was isolated. Every pause was treated like evidence. Have you ever noticed how quickly empathy disappears when a story becomes content? One moment, people say they're sorry. The next, they're arguing about intent. Then they're assigning meaning you never offered. Romy has spoken about how this made her retreat emotionally, even as her words traveled further than she ever intended. She wasn't prepared for the way public attention flattens complexity. In real life, grief is contradictory. You can love someone and feel angry. You can miss someone and feel relief. You can speak and still feel misunderstood. But public narratives don't tolerate contradiction well. They want clarity. They want villains. They want conclusions. And Romy had none to offer. She wasn't trying to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. She was trying to express a moment of pain that didn't resolve. But the moment it entered public space, people began demanding answers she didn't have. Why didn't you do more? Why speak now? What exactly did he say? Who is responsible? Those questions came not just from strangers, but from a culture that believes every tragedy must have a lesson, and every lesson must have a target. That belief is exhausting when you're grieving. Romy has described feeling like she was losing control of her own narrative. Not because she regretted speaking, but because her words were being bent into shapes she didn't recognize. She had spoken from emotion. Others were responding from ideology, curiosity, or judgment. Those are not compatible languages. And here's the contradiction that made it worse. The same people who criticized her for speaking would have criticized her for staying silent. Public grief comes with no winning move. If you speak, you're scrutinized. If you don't, you're accused of hiding something. Romy found herself trapped between those two expectations, trying to grieve while being watched. And being watched changes how you grieve. You start monitoring your emotions. You question whether you're allowed to feel certain things. You wonder if every tear will be interpreted as something else. That self-surveillance is a heavy burden. She has spoken about moments when she wanted to take everything back, not because it wasn't true, but because the cost of telling the truth felt overwhelming. There were days when she wished she had stayed quiet. Days when she wished she had never spoken publicly at all. But then the silence returned. And the silence was worse. Because silence didn't bring peace. It brought isolation. The world moved on. The commentary shifted. But the regret stayed. And that's when Romy realized something important. Speaking wasn't about correcting the narrative. It was about refusing to carry the weight alone. That realization didn't come easily. Public grief is not supportive by default. It can be intrusive. It can be judgmental. It can be impatient. People want you to grieve on a schedule. They want your emotions to make sense. They want your story to fit into a framework they already understand. But grief doesn't cooperate. Romy has described feeling pressure to clarify things she herself didn't understand, to explain emotions that didn't have names yet, to answer questions that felt premature. And every time she tried, she felt further from the truth she was trying to express. Because the truth wasn't tidy. It was fragmented. It was evolving. It was still unfolding inside her. Public attention froze it in place. That's the danger. When grief is ongoing, but the world treats it as finished. Romy wasn't done processing when people started drawing conclusions. She wasn't ready to be analyzed. She wasn't prepared to become a symbol of anything. She was just a daughter who had lost her father and realized too late that she hadn't understood the depth of his pain. That realization alone would have been heavy enough. But under public scrutiny, it became suffocating. She has spoken about feeling like she was being pulled in opposite directions. One side urging her to speak more, to clarify, to expand. The other urging her to stop, to protect herself, to retreat. Both sides claimed to care. Neither could feel what she was feeling. And that's another uncomfortable truth. Public empathy often stops at the edge of curiosity. People want to understand, until understanding requires patience. They want vulnerability, until vulnerability becomes inconvenient. They want honesty, until honesty refuses to resolve. Romy's grief refused to resolve, and that made people uncomfortable. Some tried to fill in the gaps themselves. Others criticized the gaps for existing. And in that noise, Romy felt something she hadn't expected: loneliness. Not because people weren't paying attention, but because no one could sit with uncertainty the way she was forced to. That loneliness echoed something she now believes her father may have felt: being surrounded by voices, being talked about, being discussed, and still feeling alone. That parallel wasn't lost on her. In fact, it deepened her pain, because it suggested that the same dynamic she was experiencing now, being seen but not fully understood, may have been present long before. Public grief, she realized, is a mirror. It reflects what people bring to it. Some bring compassion, some bring projection, some bring agenda. Very few bring patience. And patience is what grief requires most. Romy has shared that she learned quickly to stop reading reactions, to stop measuring her pain against other people's interpretations, to stop expecting understanding from spaces not designed for it. That withdrawal wasn't defeat. It was survival. She needed to reclaim something that had been taken from her too quickly: the right to grieve in her own way. But even withdrawal didn't erase the impact of having spoken. The words were out there. They were permanent. They were being replayed, quoted, debated. And that permanence created another layer of pressure. What if she changed her understanding later? What if her feelings evolved? What if the truth felt different as time passed? Public statements don't evolve easily. They become fixed points in a moving emotional landscape. Romy worried about that. She worried about being trapped by a version of herself speaking from acute pain, rather than long-term reflection. But she also understood something else: that speaking, imperfect as it was, had already changed her relationship with silence. She could no longer pretend everything was fine. She could no longer carry regret quietly. She could no longer hide from the truth she had uncovered. And that truth wasn't about blame. It was about listening. Listening differently. Listening longer. Listening without trying to fix. Public grief taught her something painful but necessary. That pain shared publicly will always be misunderstood by some. But pain buried privately will always isolate the one carrying it. She had to choose which cost she could live with. And she chose the one that allowed her to breathe. As the public conversation continued, Romy began to shift her focus inward, away from how her words were being received, and toward what they had revealed to her personally. She started examining patterns she hadn't noticed before, not just in her father's behavior, but in her own responses. How quickly she reassured, how often she minimized, how instinctively she assumed things would resolve on their own. Those patterns didn't come from indifference. They came from optimism, from the belief that people you love will be okay. But optimism, unchecked, can become avoidance. And that realization hurt, because it meant she couldn't simply grieve what she lost. She had to grieve what she misunderstood. Public grief stripped away the buffer that private mourning sometimes provides. It forced her to confront these realizations sooner and more intensely than she may have otherwise. That confrontation was brutal, but it was also clarifying. Romy has said that speaking publicly forced her to face her regret instead of circling it, to acknowledge it instead of suppressing it, to name it instead of letting it consume her silently. That didn't make it smaller. It made it real. And reality, even when painful, offers a path forward. Not closure, not answers, but awareness. As the public noise began to fade, as all public noise eventually does, Romy was left with the quiet again. But this time, the quiet was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with understanding. And in that space, another realization began to form. One that would change how she interpreted a single moment more than any headline ever could. Because as she replayed everything in her mind, one memory kept returning, not as a question, but as a warning she hadn't recognized. A moment that, in hindsight, felt like a turning point. And in the next chapter, we're going to step into that moment. The one Romy now believes mattered more than she ever realized. The one she replays most often. The call that didn't feel urgent at the time, but now feels impossible to forget. What if the most important moments never happened in front of anyone else? That's the question that defines this chapter. Because while the world focused on statements, timelines, and public reactions, something else was happening quietly, inside Romy's memory. Away from cameras, away from commentary, away from conclusions. This chapter isn't about events the public can analyze. It's about the internal reckoning no one can witness. Because grief doesn't just look backward. It interrogates the past. It puts every interaction on trial. It asks questions that don't have satisfying answers. And once those questions start, they don't stop. Romy has said that after the noise faded, after the articles slowed and the attention moved on, she was left alone with the parts of the story no one else could see. The pauses between conversations. The emotional subtext she hadn't noticed. The moments that felt ordinary then, but unbearable now. This is where grief becomes deeply personal. Because the public may move on, but memory doesn't. Memory sharpens. She began replaying interactions not as they felt at the time, but as they feel now. And that difference is everything. At the time, conversations felt familiar, predictable, safe, a rhythm she had known her entire life. But now, those same conversations felt unfinished, as if something had been left hanging in the air. Have you ever revisited a moment and realized it wasn't complete? You just didn't know it yet? That realization changes the emotional temperature of memory. Romy has spoken about how she started noticing patterns she hadn't seen before. Not dramatic red flags, subtle ones. A hesitation before a response. A sentence that trailed off. A change in tone that didn't match the words. Those details don't stand out in real time. They only become visible once you know where the story ends. That's the cruelty of hindsight. It gives you clarity without agency. She began asking herself questions that had no answers. Why didn't I ask what he meant by that? Why did I rush to reassure instead of listening? Why did I assume calm words meant calm feelings? Those questions weren't fueled by guilt alone. They were fueled by love. Because when you love someone, you want to believe they'll tell you if things are truly wrong. You want to trust that communication will be clear when it needs to be. But not everyone communicates pain clearly. Some people soften it. Some people disguise it. Some people don't know how to name it at all. Romy has reflected on how her father's language often stayed just on the edge of vulnerability. Enough to hint, not enough to alarm. And that's the kind of communication that slips through cracks. Because it doesn't demand a response. It invites interpretation. And interpretation depends on how closely you're listening. What the public didn't see was how Romy's understanding of listening began to change. She realized she had been listening for problems to solve, not pain to sit with. That's a common instinct. When someone you love says they're struggling, your first reaction is often to fix, to reassure, to normalize. You want to take the discomfort away. But sometimes, reassurance cuts conversation short. Sometimes saying, "You'll be okay," is the fastest way to stop someone from saying, "I'm not." Romy has spoken about recognizing this pattern in herself only after it was too late. How she now sees moments where her responses, meant to comfort, may have unintentionally closed doors. Not because she didn't care, because she cared deeply. She wanted her father to feel better. She didn't realize he might have needed her to feel with him instead. That distinction is subtle and devastating. The public doesn't see how grief teaches you emotional lessons you never asked to learn. Lessons about patience, about silence, about resisting the urge to fix what needs to be felt. Romy didn't learn those lessons in theory. She learned them through loss. Another thing the public doesn't see is how grief isolates even when you're surrounded by support. People reach out. They each held a version of him that felt complete because it was complete within that relationship. This chapter forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That love does not guarantee awareness. You can love someone deeply and still misunderstand what they're going through, not because you don't care, but because you're seeing them through a specific emotional lens. Romy has spoken about how she began questioning her own memories. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. She remembered moments of laughter, of reassurance, of normalcy, and she wondered how those moments coexisted with the pain others later described. The answer wasn't deception. It was compartmentalization. People often present different emotional selves to different people, especially within families. You don't show your children the same fears you show your peers. You don't show your youngest the same weight you show your equals. You don't show everyone the same cracks. And that means no one sees the whole structure. Romy has admitted that part of her grief came from realizing she may have been seeing the most protected version of her father, the one designed to keep her from worrying. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought guilt. Because protection, in hindsight, felt like exclusion. Not intentional exclusion, but emotional distance created out of love. And that's a brutal paradox. He may have been protecting her from his pain. She may have been protecting him from being confronted. Both acting out of care. Both unintentionally contributing to silence. When Romy listened to others describe their experiences, she began to notice how fragmented the family's understanding truly was. No one had a full timeline. No one had a complete emotional map. No one knew which version was closest to the truth. And grief turned those differences into pressure. Pressure to reconcile memories. Pressure to align narratives. Pressure to explain why things unfolded the way they did. But families don't owe the world a single story. They owe themselves honesty. And that honesty is messy. Romy has said that one of the most painful realizations was understanding that her father may have felt misunderstood by everyone in different ways. Not unseen, misunderstood. Seen, but through incomplete frames. That kind of misunderstanding can feel lonelier than invisibility, because it means people are looking at you, but not seeing what hurts. Have you ever experienced that? Being surrounded by people who care, yet feeling like no one truly understands what you're carrying? That's the loneliness Romy now believes her father may have been navigating. Not isolation, not abandonment, but fragmentation. Each relationship offering support, but none offering the specific understanding he needed. And because no one person had the full picture, no one knew how serious it was. This is where the story pushes back against a dangerous myth. The myth that someone surrounded by family cannot feel alone. Loneliness isn't about numbers. It's about resonance. It's about whether anyone hears the frequency you're speaking in. Romy's reflections have made it clear that she doesn't blame anyone else for what happened. If anything, she has become acutely aware of how shared responsibility can feel like no responsibility at all. Everyone believed someone else was closer. Everyone believed someone else would notice first. Everyone believed someone else had the deeper insight. And those beliefs canceled each other out. That's not negligence. That's diffusion. And diffusion is one of the most dangerous emotional dynamics there is, because it allows silence to persist under the illusion of care. Romy has said that understanding this has changed how she approaches every relationship now, that she no longer assumes understanding exists just because love does. She asks more questions. She listens longer. She resists the urge to reassure too quickly, because reassurance can sometimes shut down conversation instead of opening it. When someone says, "I'm struggling," and we reply, "You'll be okay," we may be offering comfort, but we may also be closing a door. Romy wishes she had known that then. She wishes she had understood that asking follow-up questions isn't intrusive, it's attentive. But regret doesn't come with instructions for undoing the past. It only offers lessons for the future. And this is where the emotional weight of this chapter settles. Not on blame, not on guilt, but on awareness. Awareness that families are made of perspectives, not absolutes. Awareness that silence can exist even where love is abundant. Awareness that understanding must be actively built, not assumed. As we move into the next chapter, the focus shifts again, from internal family dynamics to the outside world pressing in. Because once Romy spoke, the public narrative intensified. Grief stopped being private. Pain became a topic of debate. And when the weight of public grief collided with personal regret, it created a new kind of pressure, one that forced Romy to confront something she wasn't prepared for. The realization that mourning in the spotlight changes everything. And once you hear how that pressure affected her, and how close she came to retreating back into silence, you'll understand why speaking out became both her greatest fear and her only relief. What happens when your private pain becomes public property before you've even learned how to breathe again? That's the question Romy found herself facing next. Because grief, when it's forced into the spotlight, changes shape. It stops being something you process internally and becomes something you're expected to perform, explain, or defend. And that pressure can be crushing. For Romy, the days after she spoke were not clarifying. They were disorienting. The world